The Natural Selection.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Natural Selection podcast, brought to you by the University of Exeter's Centre for Ecology and Conservation. It's a new academic year, and we have a new team of students ready to bring our listeners the second season of exciting podcasts. I'm Emily.
I'm Tess.
And I'm Laura. And today we'll be talking to Dr Rob Ogden, Programme Director of the Trace Wildlife Forensics Network, an international NGO which uses forensic science to investigate wildlife crime and promote biodiversity conservation worldwide. On his latest visit to the University of Exeter, we were able to catch up with Dr Ogden to talk about his work.
Hi Rob, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. So first of all, could you explain for our listeners what wildlife forensics actually is?
Sure. So forensic science is the use of analytical techniques to support law enforcement. And so wildlife forensics is really taking a suite of existing techniques and using them to investigate crimes against wildlife. We normally focus in wildlife forensics on identifying the wildlife concerned, so it's identification of biological material.
So how did you first get involved in wildlife forensics, and how was the Trace network set up?
I was running a conservation genetics lab back in 2003, 2004, and we originally had a call actually from the RSPCA in the UK asking us whether or not we could investigate dog fighting. So not wildlife as such, domestic dogs, and looking at providing forensic evidence for dogfighting investigations. And we did this, and then we moved on from there to look at things like issues of bird of prey theft in the UK, and gradually we developed a reputation and a range of techniques for looking at wildlife forensic casework.
So what are the current issues regarding wildlife law enforcement that Trace can help deal with?
Essentially, it's about trying to use techniques that we already have available to us in a more, comprehensive way. So a lot of people are spending quite a lot of time and money on trying to develop new techniques for wildlife law enforcement, new forensic techniques, but in most parts of the world, we don't have at the moment the capacity to apply the techniques we already have available. So take something simple like DNA sequencing for species ID. In countries that are losing biodiversity very rapidly or involved in transit or endpoint of the illegal wildlife trade, they can't apply that technique, which is fairly run-of-the-mill in a forensic context very easily. So I think the biggest hurdle we face is currently capacity building.
What would you say are the largest challenges of working on such an international project?
I guess the number of different countries and dealing with the different systems in the different countries. So to go in and try and provide support, you have to have political buy-in, and you have to try and find a model that will fit each individual country. So sometimes it will be a human forensic lab that is branching out to do wildlife work. In other cases it will be a wildlife research lab that wants to do forensics. And trying to also integrate that into the existing enforcement systems in different countries. So this is all kind of high-level stuff. The actual techniques are relatively straightforward.
You have mentioned a range of applications for wildlife forensics. What would you say is the most common issue you deal with?
The most common issue is proving what something is. So once you've got something that you suspect has been illegally traded, you need to identify what species it is. The law is based on different species, and different species have different requirements and regulations around them. So species ID, and if something's been processed or chopped up or had its identifiable characteristics removed, then that's when they need forensic help.
At the University of Exeter, we have a big focus on conservation. How does the Trace network feed into this?
We see wildlife forensics as being, the enforcement end of a conservation spectrum. So conservation traditionally is focused on understanding and protecting habitats and species, particularly in protected areas in certain countries. Increasingly now, conservation involves law enforcement and making sure that laws to protect species are able to be enforced and enacted, and wildlife forensics sort of sits in that realm. So we're supporting the enforcement of laws that are supporting conservation.
Since you started TRACE in 2006, how do you think genetic techniques and other scientific advancements have helped you in your field?
So since, it's 10 years ago, genetics has changed massively. I guess at that time, in terms of the ability to sequence the genome, the human genome had just been sequenced. We're now sequencing things in a matter of days. So sequencing power has increased, the amount of genetic data has increased. The questions in wildlife forensics have broadly remained the same, though. So some of the techniques haven't changed at all. Techniques like geographic assignment, though, are changing, and our power to detect where something has come from, which needs a lot of DNA information usually, that's really increased with increased sequencing power. So some things have stayed the same, but in a genomics era we now have a better ability to understand exactly where something has come from. I guess that's probably the biggest area of change.
In our master's course, we've recently been using the new nanopore MinION devices, which are portable genetic sequencing devices that can potentially be used in the field. Do you currently use this kind of technology, or is it something you'll be using in the future?
So right now, no. I guess there are two phases to that question. One is how do you use a field test in a forensic context? And normally we use them a little bit like breathalyzers. So if you get stopped for potentially drink driving, you'll have a breath test. If it goes red, then you'll be taken off and have a blood test. And so it's called a presumptive test, a test that's run in the field. On its own, it won't stand up in court, but it informs the enforcement officials about whether or not to go further. So we use field tests in wildlife forensics in much the same way. Do we have reason to seize a shipment, for example? So the idea of having a field-based DNA sequencer to some extent might be a really, really nice idea. But it's complicated because you're probably asking that to be used by an enforcement officer rather than a scientist. And you're probably going to have to do a lab-based confirmation test anyway. So we're very excited by the prospect of being able to do field-based DNA analysis. But the applications in terms of forensics are not quite so simple. So I think it's a wait and see, but it's something we are looking at.
So for our listeners who are interested in this kind of work, how would you advise them to get involved?
It really depends on what level. I mean, if they're budding forensic scientists, then the advice would be to stay in a scientific discipline as far as they can in terms of academia. So if you want to be a chemist, become a chemist and then branch off into forensics, or the same with being a geneticist. So that from a forensic science point of view is key. Other than that, I think just raising awareness and being involved in the fight against illegal wildlife trade is really important. Enforcement isn't going to solve this alone. We need to stop people from buying things, whether that be traditional Asian medicines or whether it be illegally sourced pets coming into Europe. And so on a global level, we need to be reducing the consumption of wildlife, and that will make everyone's life easier.
So finally, just looking to the future, what's the way forward for TRACE and wildlife forensics?
Well, sadly, the future is quite bright because there's an awful lot of this work now required. So in an ideal world, we'd all be out of a job because we wouldn't be having to investigate illegal wildlife trade. The illegal wildlife trade is very large at the moment. It's recognised as a multinational organised crime, and more countries are trying to develop their own capacity for using these kind of techniques. So TRACE is one of the relatively few organisations that are able to build capacity in this area. So from our point of view, it's looking fairly busy.
Unfortunately. Well, that's it. That's all our questions for you. So just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us, and good luck in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we'd like to thank Dr Rob Ogden for talking to us about wildlife forensics and the TRACE network. You can find out more information on their website, tracenetwork.org. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter.
So once again, we've been Emily,
Tess.
And Laura.
Thanks for listening and stay tuned for our next episode.
The Natural Selection.